Hi everyone. Today we are going to be making the Birdie Dress. I have this beautiful woven cotton that I'm going to be using to make both of the versions today. So the gingham one I'm going to use to show you version A, which is the big ruffled collar. And then this pretty magenta is going to be for version B, which is the simpler collar. You can add embellishments around it with the decorative stitches on your sewing machine. And it's a really nice little function that I feel like doesn't get used often enough. Also, whether you're new to sewing or have been at it for a while, this pattern is great for you. So I think that as a beginner, it's really nice to push your limits. You'll learn how to do a collar installment. You'll do button plackets with some interfacing, make buttonholes, and it's just kind of nice to push your limits and show some other decorative features on a garment that maybe you haven't tried yet. As for everyone else, you know what to do. This is just another walk in the park. And hopefully it goes swimmingly, because sometimes sewing doesn't, as we all know. But this one will, because it's been tested and proven. Okay, yeah, I want to see what you make though. So tag me at the Mech brand on Instagram, and you can like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. That is so helpful. It's free to do, and it really helps me build my community for sewing. So like and subscribe, please, and thank you. So, without further ado, let's make the Birdie Dress. So first for our pattern pieces, we have version A, which is the ruffled collar. We have 2 pairs mirrored, and then your interfacing pieces and all of our ruffle strips. Then we have version B for the simple collar. So 2 pairs mirrored and also your interfacing. And then here we have our back bodice piece, which is cut on the fold, and then our 2 front panels and our interfacing strips for the button plackets, 2 of our armhole bias tapes, and 1 neck bias tape. Step 1, construct the collar. To do this, you're going to take your collar panel pieces and you're going to put them wrong sides together. And then you're going to pin that center back seam right along the edge, and so 1/2 an inch from the edge. And repeat this step with your other 2 collar panels. And your machine setting should be set to a straight stitch, so about 2.5 millimeters in length, and then the tension can hover between 3 and 4. Step 2, attach the collar interfacing. Here we have our 2 collar panels, and we've pressed open those center seams in the back, and now we're going to set one aside, and this is our chosen one. So we're going to make sure that the wrong side is facing up, and we're going to take both of our interfaced pieces, and we want to put glue side down on the wrong side of the fabric. So just line up the center back seam with that straight edge of the interface piece, and you're going to make the match in the middle. And then you should have about a 1/2 inch perimeter around that interfacing on the collar panel. Once that's all set, you're going to take it to your ironing board and give it a nice press. For those of you making the simple collar, go ahead and skip ahead to minute 12:36. Now for the ruffled collar, this is step 3, form the ruffles. Now with your 2 long ruffle strips, you are going to overlap them right sides together, lining up those diagonal edges, and you want those corners to be sticking out about a 1/2 an inch, and we're going to sew a 1/2 an inch from the edge. Step 4, sew ruffle strips together. So we have our 2 very long ruffle strips, and what we're going to do now is layer them right sides facing each other. So you're going to take one and flip it over, lining up the edges. So what you want to do here is sew along 3 of the sides. Starting with that short end, you're going to sew all the way down this end, joining the strips together, and then you're going to finish it off by sewing up the short end. Here it is with the two strips sewn together. I've sewn a 1/2 inch seam allowance all along that long end, and I've left the other long end open. So you want that to be open so we can turn it right sides facing out. Before we do that, we just want to trim the excess seam allowance off of those edges so that it reduces the bulk. Step 5, baste the ruffle strip. Now that our ruffle strip is beautifully turned right side out and the corners are nice and sharp, we are going to baste along that open edge. And this basting stitch, or I should say these basting stitches, are going to act as a pull to make our gathers. So you'll sew a 1/4 inch from the edge and then another 1/4 inch from that seam that you just made. So for our sewing machine, we want to go for a basting stitch. So your length you're going to make as long as possible. And then the tension, we just want to dial back a bit so it's a touch looser than you would normally sew a seam with. Another important thing to note for your basting stitch are pull your sewing tails to be longer. This will prevent your string from slipping through whenever you're making your gathers. So now you just want to line that presser foot up with the edge of your fabric, and we're going to sew a 1/4 inch from the edge all the way along that long seam. Here it is finished. And now we just want to sew another one a 1/4 inch from that original basting stitch. Take it slow here and try to keep it as even from the first stitch line as possible. All right, so just to show you, here is our finished ruffle strip before we gather it. There's our long basting tails. We have both of our basting stitches a 1/2 inch within the seam allowance of the raw edge. And here is our beautifully folded edge that's already finished. Step 6, join collar panels and ruffles. Now we're going to take our collar panel that has been interfaced and we're going to flip it so that right sides are facing up. And to join the ruffle strip to the collar, you're just going to grab your ruffle strip, and what I like to do is just fold it in half and mark that center back line of the ruffle strip. You can do this by using a fabric marker, or in my case, I just use a needle. So I stick that right in the center mark of the strip, and then what we're going to do next is line that up with the center back seam of the interfaced collar panel. So pin those two together. Make sure that the right side of your collar panel is facing up and that the raw edge of your ruffle strip is facing out along the outer edge of your collar panel. Just work through it, make sure there's no twists or turns, and when you get to the edge, just line that up with the notch marked on the collar. This is important because when we attach the collar to the neckline, we want to make sure we aren't sewing into that ruffle strip. So that gap there makes it possible. So I'm doing the same thing on this side, just lining up the edge with that little notch. And now what we want to do is identify our basting stitches. So we have the top threads, and then you have the bobbin threads on your basting stitch. And it's very important that you are pulling the same ones on both ends. So for instance, on the right end, we want to make sure we're pulling the bobbin thread. And on the left end, we want to make sure we're pulling the bobbin thread. This will just prohibit it from getting stuck when you're pulling the gathering. You just want to make sure that you're getting both of the threads on the same side. So here, I'm just pulling the threads to start my gathering, slowly working around that collar and pinning them in place, just making sure that they're all evenly gathered. This is looking beautiful. You can kind of get excited. It's starting to take shape. And friendly reminder, this is just the back side. It's interfaced, and here we have all of our ruffles being pinned. So we're just going to work along that other side doing the same exact thing. Voila! I wish it was that fast in real life. So we have it all pinned, evenly gathered. And now what we're going to do is sew a basting stitch 1/4 inch from the edge just to hold this together to that panel. And just be really careful around the corners. I have it pinned like crazy so that it's laying nice and flat. And you want to make sure that you don't pick up any of those gathers into those corners. So just stay right along the edge to hold it in place. Okay, our ruffles are beautifully basted to our interfaced collar panel, and this is just going to hold it in place while we attach the other side of this collar to this one. So you want to take your non-interfaced collar panel, and this is the raw edge right here, so this is the wrong side of the fabric, and you want to lay that on top of the interfaced panel right sides together, and we'll sew around a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So to do this, you want to line up the center back seams and then the notches that are on the outer edges of the collar. So what I like to do is take the ruffles in the corners and I pin them down so that they stay out of the way when I'm joining these panels. Nothing's worse than when you pick up the end of a ruffle and it makes everything look all wonky. So I lay them nice and flat, and then I take that notch of the collar panel and line it up with the interfaced notch. Pin that in place, and then just continue pinning along that outer edge of the collar. So here we have it all pinned up, and you noticed I only pinned on the outer edge, and we are going to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance there, leaving that inner neckline open. So sew a 1/2 inch along the outer edge. All right, I have trimmed away the excess seam allowance along the outer edge, and now we can turn it right side out. This part is always really satisfying to me because you just get to see your almost finished collar and these beautiful ruffles. I just love it. It makes it all worth it. So here is our collar. It's looking great. You just want to pull out those corners nice and tight, and then we just want to remove any basting stitches that may still be there and iron it so it's laying nice and flat. Look at this beauty. Okay, so the last thing we have to do here is put a basting stitch on the inner neckline. This is going to prepare us for whenever we attach this collar to the dress, and you just want to make sure that you line up those notches that are for the shoulders and just sew a 1/4 inch basting stitch right along the inner neckline. Okay, if you just made this ruffled collar, you can skip ahead to minute 17:25. And for the simple collar, this is step 3, join the collar panels. So we have our 2 collar panels, one is interfaced and one is not. You're going to flip the interfaced side over, right sides facing up, and then you want to lay that uninterfaced panel right sides together. Now you want to line up your notches. So pin the center back notches, the sides, the collar points, and then these inner notches. And once you have those pinned, we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the outer edge. We are not sewing the inner edge. You want to leave that seam open so we can flip it right side out. Okay, now we can turn this right side out. Okay, now that we're all turned out the right way, you want to make sure the interfaced side is facing up, and you just want to give it a good press all the way around. All right, so we have our beautiful collar nice and ironed, and we have our interface side facing up. And now what we want to do is line up the center back, the notches and the ends, and sew a 1/4 inch basting stitch along the inner neckline. Step 4, add decorative stitching. So here's our beautifully simple collar. And if you want to, you can add decorative stitching, or if you don't have that option, you can add rickrack or lace, anything you want. I chose to do decorative stitching because my machine has those capabilities. Here's a sample collar that I did earlier, and basically if you choose the stitching or anything for that option, 3/8 of an inch from the edge is what I did here, and I find that it looks very nice. It's a nice trimming. So I'm going to do the same on this collar. So before we get started, if you have a Singer heavy duty, you're going to put your tension, you can kind of play with it on a scrap piece of fabric. Right now mine's around 3.5. I always put my width as wide as it can go. So in this case, it is a 6. And then here's all of our decorative stitches. So you can kind of take a piece of scrap fabric and play around to see how you like how they look. In my case, I have all of these. and I just sampled some of the ones on that disc, and then I'll choose from there and see which one I want to rim my collar. Another really important thing is make sure your bobbin is full, or at least has enough thread to cover the perimeter of your collar. The last thing you want is to run out of thread and have a gap in your decorative stitches. So bobbin has to be full, and test it on scrap fabric first to make sure that the tension, width, length is everything you want it to be. All right, the next important thing is make sure you have the interface side of the collar facing up. We want to be top stitching on the interfaced side of the collar. So I just line my presser foot up with the edge of the collar, drop it down, and I begin sewing. Do not backstitch, no backstitching. Lower your needle, and we're gonna start sewing. Just take it nice and easy. Okay, the corners can be a little tricky, so you just want to go as slow as possible, and you might have to stop your needle and pivot. Maybe not. So right now I'm going to do a little tiny pivot, and then I'm going to pivot again. And just take it super duper slow. All right, decorative stitching complete. I just love the detail that this gives to a collar, and it's a great use for that stitch setting on your sewing machine. Anyway, we are going to set this aside for now while we work on the bodice. Step 7, sew the button plackets. So here we have our 2 front bodice pieces, and we want them wrong sides facing up. Down at the bottom on the pattern, there are 2 notches, and at the top we have our 2 points. These are your fold marks. So what you want to do here is take your interfacing strips that are 1 inch wide, and you want to line them up within those fold notches, so right down the channel. So I like to start at the bottom, line them up between the notches, and then you just want to make sure that your interfacing is going straight up in that channel. So there should be a 3/8 of an inch edge along the center front. Now, if you don't trust yourself, you can take a ruler and mark with chalk from that tippy top point all the way down to that first bottom notch, and then you can line up your interfacing strip along that chalk line just to make sure that it is all the same distance from that center edge. All right, now that our interfacing is ironed in place, we are just going to fold the first fold, and then we're going to fold in the second fold. So just iron down the first fold, iron down the second fold, and it'll conceal the raw edges. And here are our finished button plackets. So you can see that angle lines perfectly with the neckline. And just to show you the inside, we have our interfacing and then that raw edge tucked under. Now, this is the wrong side of the fabric. What we want to do is flip it over to the right side, and we are just going to top stitch right down where that button placket folds under. So if you don't feel comfortable doing that, you can stitch from the wrong side. Just keep in mind that your bobbin thread is going to be visible on the front, so make sure it's the same color. Okay, so here I have my placket. I'm stitching from the top side, and I just marked with a piece of tape so that we keep it equidistant, but make sure you're picking up that fabric underneath. All right, and now we are going going to edge stitch right on the outer edge. Step 8, join the shoulders. Okay, so here are our bodice pieces. We have all the right sides facing up, and before we join the shoulder seams, I'm just going to finish my edges along the side and my shoulder edges. You can use a serger or a zigzag stitch, but I'm just doing the side seams and the shoulder seams only. All right, our edges are nice and clean. So what we want to do now is take our front bodice pieces on top of the back with right sides together. And you're going to carefully line up the shoulder edges on both sides, pin in place, and then we want to sew with a 1/2 inch seam allowance to join the shoulders. All right, I have joined my shoulder seams and ironed them open so they're laying nice and flat. Now we can flip that right side out just to get a little peek of our dress bodice. Step 9, attach the collar. So with your neck bias tape, this is the longer bias tape, we are going to begin by laying it wrong sides facing up. And we want to fold up 3/8 of an inch along one of the long edges and iron that in place. This is just going to make it easier for us whenever we're flipping the bias tape to the inside of the garment to conceal the raw edges. Now we're going to take our bodice and with right sides facing up, we're going to attach the collar. So we just want to base this collar into place first and foremost. And now there are a couple notable things on the pattern, and those would be the notches. So in the collar, we have a notch for our center back that we want to line up with the bodice. And then we have notches for our shoulder seams. So you should find a little notch on both inner edges of the collar, line that up with your shoulder seam, pin it in place, and then we can do the same thing with the other side, line up that notch with the shoulder seam, pin it in place. This is going to make it so much easier when attaching to make sure everything lays nice. The last notch here is on the bodice. So we have our collar end notch. It should fall somewhere in the middle of the button placket, and pin the end of the collar to that notch and repeat with the other side. And why we're doing this, it's just to ease the collar into place. And what that means is that you might have to pull a bit on the bodice fabric so that it evenly distributes around the whole inner edge of the collar. So 1/4 inch all along that inner edge. So as a reminder, we're basting along the edge of this to hold the collar in place. And as you're going, just ease in the collar. So make sure your edges are lined up and just begin sewing right along that original basting line. All right, so our collar is basted in place. Now we want to take our neckline bias tape that we just sewed one of the long ends of, and you want to fold it in half to find the center. And when you find that, you are just going to line up with right sides together the raw edges of the bias tape and the inner neckline. Pin that center back in place, and then you're just going to work all around that bias tape, pinning it in place to the neckline. I'm just going to show you a closer look here. So I'm pinning the bias tape right sides together and we're sandwiching the collar, but you want to take this all the way to the end of the button placket. So make sure you pin so that the end of the collar is in place. And then you also want to make sure you sew all the way to the end of this button placket. So your stitch should end somewhere down here. So just sew 3/8 of an inch all the way along that inner neckline. Alrighty, so our bias tape is attached to the neckline, and what we're going to end up doing is folding it up, but before we do that, we want to trim the excess seam allowance all along that inner neckline. Be very careful when you're doing this. don't cut into the stitch you just made. I've made that mistake before. Go slow and just trim the excess. Alrighty, I have trimmed the excess off, and now what we're gonna do is edge stitch right on top of the bias tape along that seam line we just made. So what this does is it attaches that seam allowance to the bias tape so it lays nice and flat. So just take it to your machine and edge stitch on the bias tape side. So to show you what I mean, this is the bias tape. We're going to detangle our sewing machine and lay it flat. Bring it over here, put your needle down on the edge, and just begin stitching. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Make sure you're picking up that seam allowance underneath. Okay, so we have this all spanned out. Wrong sides are facing up now, so we see the inside of the garment. And we are going to roll that bias tape toward the inside of our dress. And we're going to be attaching it all along the inner seam line with the raw edges folded under. But I like to start at the end, so you have this excess that you can tuck underneath. And this is kind of long here, so you can just take your scissors, give it a little trim, but be careful, don't cut off too much. You want to have enough to tuck in those raw edges. So a closer look, I am just folding that in like so, and then folding it down, and you can pin it in place. And then we're just going to repeat that all along the edge. So make sure your raw edges are folded under, make sure that your bias tape is laying flat, and pin it to the inside of your garment. As you do this, make sure your bodice panels aren't bunching up. So you can see here they're nice and flat, pinned to the bias tape. So continue along doing that and just keep checking as you go, making sure your panels are laying nice and flat. So here we have it all pinned up, raw edges folded under, and then underneath it is laying beautifully. Once that's all pinned in place, we are going to edge stitch along the fold. All right, so starting from the folded button placket, we're going to put our needle in, do a couple stitches to hold that in place. Get to the corner, pivot, and now we can begin edge stitching all along here. Now we can admire our beautifully finished neckline. So we have attached our collar, and now we can take it to our ironing board and give it a nice press so that the collar is laying flat. Step 10, join the side seams. All right, so time to join the side seams. We are going to flip our dress inside out, so right sides together. And you just want to pin along those side seams, and we're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all down the side. And here is our bodice. Our seams have been finished and pressed beautifully. Step 11, finish the arm openings. So similar to our neck bias tape, we have 2 arm bias tapes, and we are going to put them wrong sides facing up and fold up 3/8 of an inch and iron it flat. All right, so we have our bodice right sides facing up, and you want to take your bias tape, wrong sides facing up, and we're going to align the bias tape's raw edge with the armhole's raw edge. Now you should have about a 1/2 inch excess right here, and what you want to do is just fold that in to conceal the raw edge and pin it in place right at the side seam. So go ahead and pin that in place, and then we're going to work that bias tape all the way around, pinning it in place until you get to this end. Now that we've done that, we have another raw end to work with. So we're going to overlap it with that folded end and pin it in place. You can put a couple pins there just to make sure that it's laying nice and flat. And I'll just flip it here to show you whenever you have it completed, that raw edge is totally concealed. So now you might have a little bit of extra. You can just go through and cut that. And we are going to sew 3/8 of an inch all the way around that raw edge. Okay, when sewing armholes, I remove this and then we can just slip this right under. And I just start with my needle in at the armpit and just begin sewing all the way around. Okay, this is just the same as the neckline. So we have attached our bias tape to each armhole, and this is right sides facing up, mind you. So now what we want to do is very carefully trim the excess seam allowance on both armholes. So I've trimmed the seam allowance, and now what we want to do is flip that bias tape so the right side is up, and we're going to edge stitch on the bias tape right along that original seam line. All right, so I have sewn on the bias tape to attach it to the seam allowance. And now what we're gonna do is open up our garment so that the inside is facing up. And we just wanna carefully go and flip that bias tape toward the inside of the dress. Pin it in place. And then at the bottom here, just make sure that your ends are folded in and on top of each other to conceal the raw edges. And then we are just going to flip that in and pin it down. And just slowly work your way along the whole perimeter of that bias tape, and we're going to edge stitch along the fold. Okay, take a minute to admire your dress. We've come so far. The armholes are looking great. You have the bias tape making the inside look so finished. And now we can move along to the last couple steps. Step 12, hem the dress. Okay, so here we have the raw edge hem of our dress, and what you want to do is just open up your dress so that the inside is facing up, and we are going to double roll this hem 3/8 of an inch. So roll it 3/8 of an inch once, and then roll it again 3/8 of an inch and iron in place. All right, listen up. This is important. So before we sew the hem, we need to line up our button plackets. So find that tip at the top, line them up, and make sure that your bottoms are matching. Nothing's worse than sewing a hem only to find that your sides are uneven. So do this step, it'll save you. And here is our finished hem. Looking great. There's the inside. And now we can move on to the last step. Step 13, sew the buttonholes and buttons. It is button time, yay! So this dress has 8 buttons, could be more if you decide to go with a longer hem, but what I like to do is take a button and do a sample buttonhole on a scrap piece of fabric. This will help us to measure the length and the distance between each. So here's my buttonhole. I'm just going to measure what that is. So it looks to be just shy of an inch long. And what we're going to do with that measurement is mark it on our right placket. So you are going to start by measuring down 3/8 of an inch from the top in the center of your button placket. And we are going to mark the length of that buttonhole that we just measured. So I'm just going to take some chalk, put a little line, and you can see here I'm marking the bottom of the buttonhole and then the length of the buttonhole right there. So this dress calls for a 2-inch gap between each button. So I'm just going to measure down 2 inches, and then I'll draw another line the length of my buttonhole, and you can just continue this all the way down the button placket. Okay, so this is what I mean. This is going to be the start of our buttonhole. So you want to slide this underneath your presser foot and line up that chalk mark in the buttonhole presser foot channel right here. That one right there. And you also want to make sure that your buttonhole presser foot is lining up in the center. So you want to make sure this point is equidistant from your button plackets. Then we can go ahead and lower our needle and begin sewing. Okay, so I have put all of my buttonholes in and I carefully ripped them open. And the last step is to just mark our button placements. So I normally just line up my 2 plackets and then I take a ruler and go in the center of the buttonhole and just mark a dot right across from it in the center of the opposing button placket. And I'll just do that for each of the buttonholes, working my way down. Ta-da! Here is our dress. It's looking so good. Don't forget to add a tag if you have one. Always sign your work as a designer and admire your dress.